everybody. We were asked to make certain that we're heard. So if this echoes too much, let me know. Okay. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I really want to thank Dean Napoli and the Dean's office, particularly Jennifer Matisse for organizing this. Also for the Wolf Institute for doing everything that they're doing, and to all of you for being here for the last panel, effectively, of the Student Expo. And for those of you who are presenting, if you don't know, the last panel is kind of the kiss of death, just like the 8 a.m. panel on the first day. So what we have here are 5 students who are presenting the research that they are putting together for our Capstone seminar. They're all writing 20 to 30 page original research papers on their own topics, which is also a testament to many of you in this room who have also worked with these students and helped develop their own interests. I'd also like to note that 2 of them presented in totally different disciplines yesterday evening. One brought somebody else in the room to tears. Our first presenter is Adacia Robin Thomas, and she has a previous engagement, so she basically needs to leave as soon as we're done. So I was thinking what we would do is have her present, we can do questions then, and then the other presentations can happen, and then we'll hold questions till the very end. So other than that, welcome to what I have to say is probably the best cohort of students I've had in the Capstone in 10 years. This group is really extraordinary.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Adacia. Welcome to Black Gold and Broken Chains, Neo-Colonialism in Guyana's Oil Boom. This title reflects how Guyana's newfound oil wealth, black gold, is entangled with lingering colonial era constraints, broken chains. The goal is to explore whether Guyana's oil boom is a story of empowerment or a new form of dependency. My name, again, is Adacia Thomas. I will be guiding you through this analysis of U.S. influence on Guyana's oil trade. So my research question is, how do U.S. policies shape Guyana's oil sector, and which theoretical framework, neocolonialism and dependency theory, or liberal institutionalism best explains this relationship? The central research question asks us to consider the role of the United States in Guyana's oil sector and to determine which lens better explains this relationship, neocolonialism, dependency, or liberal institutionalism. In simpler terms, is U.S. influence and ExxonMobil's presence creating a new form of colonial dependency, or can they be seen as part of a mutually beneficial partnership through international cooperation? This question is critical for understanding whether Guyana's dramatic oil boom, starting with major offshore discoveries in 2015 and production since 2019, is empowering the country or binding it in golden chains of dependence. My thesis is that Guyana's oil boom experience is best explained by neocolonialism and dependency theory, not liberal institutionalism. U.S. and corporate involvement, especially by ExxonMobil, has created an unequal partnership that echoes colonial-era exploitation. So, my argument is that Guyana's relationship with the U.S. in the oil sector is a neo-colonial one, defined by dependency. While liberal institutionalism would frame U.S.-Guyana oil dealings as cooperative and mutually beneficial, the evidence suggests otherwise. Guyana, though politically independent, finds its oil wealth largely controlled by an American multinational, ExxonMobil, and shaped by U.S. interests. The scales are tipped. Benefits to Guyana are limited, and power asymmetries persist. Historical context matters. As a former British colony, Guyana is vulnerable to new forms of control. The liberal institutionalist promises of equal partnership and development through foreign investment have not materialized evenly. Instead, the dynamic resembles oil imperialism, wealth extraction by foreign powers, with Guyana in a subordinate position. In the following slides, we'll see how ExxonMobil's dominance and the actions of both U.S. and Guyanese elites support this argument. So, a key piece of evidence is ExxonMobil's overwhelming control of Guyana's oil. ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore reserves, over 11 billion barrels, and through aggressive negotiations, locked in a contract that heavily favors the company. Guyana's share is a modest 2% royalty plus half of profit oil, but only after Exxon recovers all costs. This means Exxon recoups its investments first, which can take years, delaying Guyana's full benefit. According to a Global Witness report, the exploitative terms of this deal may deprive Guyana of up to $55 billion that it should have earned. That's neo-colonial style exploitation in modern form. Neo-colonial influence doesn't occur in a vacuum. It often requires the cooperation of local elites. In Guyana, there is evidence that some government officials and businessmen have been complicit in creating an environment highly favorable to U.S. oil interests. For example, regulatory agencies in Guyana approved Exxon's permits swiftly and with limited oversight. A 2022 analysis by Shaw noted that Guyanese authorities established a fiscal and legal framework, low taxes, stability clauses, etc., that heavily incentivized Exxon's investments. While attracting investment is positive, the imbalance suggests elites were willing to accept suboptimal terms. Okay. Liberal institutionalism's shortcomings. If liberal institutionalism worked perfectly, Guyana's relationship with the U.S. and Exxon would be a win-win. Indeed, there are elements of cooperation. The U.S. provides financial support, for example, funding a gas-to-energy plant, technical training, and is a major market for Guyana's oil. Guyana, in return, offers a stable investment climate and has signed bilateral and multilateral agreements meant to ensure fair play. However, the evidence of outcome shows the limits of this approach. Guyana's government revenues, while increasing, are nowhere near what they could be under a fair contract. And much of the population still faces poverty and infrastructure deficits. The optimistic narrative of shared prosperity is undermined by the fact that Exxon and its partners reap disproportionate profits and make the key decisions. As one analysis noted, the lion's share of oil revenues continues to flow to U.S.-based corporations. Although liberal institutionalism provides an appealing narrative of win-win outcomes, empirical evidence from Guyana suggests that the benefits of cooperation are unevenly distributed. In other words, without addressing the core imbalance of power and bargaining leverage, institutions alone have not freed Guyana from dependency. This underscores the main point of the presentation. In conclusion, Guyana's experience confirms that neocolonialism and dependency theory best explain its relationship with the United States. Despite formal independence and new oil wealth, the evidence shows that control over critical sectors like oil remains in the hands of U.S. corporations like ExxonMobil. Domestic elites have often aligned with these interests, and liberal institutions have not adequately protected Guyana from exploitation. In 2025, the Trump administration imposed a 38% tariff on many Guyanese exports, including seafood and agricultural goods. Ironically, oil, bauxite, and gold were exempted from the tariffs, the very industries dominated by American companies. This selective tariff policy shows that even in trade, the structures of neocolonialism persist. U.S. corporations protect their own interests abroad, while Guyana's local industries, the ones truly owned by Guyanese people, are left vulnerable to economic punishment. The tariffs also expose the hollowness of liberal institutionalism's promise that treaties and agreements ensure fairness. Despite Guyana's participation in bilateral agreements and global institutions, the U.S. was able to unilaterally impose damaging tariffs without significant repercussion. This reinforces the argument that without real structural change, developing nations like Guyana will continue to be exposed to external economic coercion, no matter how many cooperative frameworks exist on paper. Ultimately, the broken change in our title symbolized not only the struggle to control natural resources, but also the broader fight against economic dependency, unequal trade relationships, and political vulnerability. To truly break free, Guyana must renegotiate unfair oil contracts, diversify its economy beyond extractive industries, and build stronger domestic industries that are less exposed to the whims of foreign power. That's it. Yeah, do you guys have any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. So my mom is from Guyana. This is like my country. So basically with that, I have an ethnographic approach in a way, because I hear about these things through conversation. So one of the elites that is colluding with America, his name is Jack Dale. He's like one of the most hated people in Guyana. Money laundering, there's a lot that goes into it as well. And as for choosing this method, my original research was supposed to be on how racial and economic disparities influence voting within Guyana, but I couldn't really find any information on that. So I was like, let me think more on a global scale. And I ended up thinking about like, okay, we have oil, which is brand new to our country. We have the fastest growing GDP in the world right now. And because of hearing about like how the people are struggling in Guyana itself, I was like, I wonder like what the US has to do with this. So that's how I ended up, yeah. Any other questions? Nope. Oh, yes. Mhm. Okay. So I figured it out basically because we were in Capstone seminar and we were talking about liberal institutionalism and dependency theory. And when thinking about my new research question, those were the first two that actually came to mind, and I thought would best fit the type of research I want to look for and things that I would be able to find as well, especially articles, because, you know, Guyana is pretty brand new, so it's kind of hard to find research on it. So when thinking about the two theories, I was like, okay, I have to pick theories that I'd be able to find research on. You know what I mean? And they're pretty simple to find research on. No, that's it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Cindy Lynn, and my topic's on the gender gap worsening across time through domestic labor and class. So for an overview, I will start out with my research question, and I'll go through some frameworks that delve into the feminist perspectives. Then I'll get into my argument, which is the main thesis. And this is going to be really delved into political theory, and it takes a chronological textual analysis of ancient times, Regency era, and then the modern world. and then we'll do a conclusion and recommendations for this issue. So my research question is, why is the gender gap exacerbated over time? The gender gap has a long history associated with patriarchy, which places the superiority of men over women. This gap has transformed itself to seem unrecognizable, especially with the rise of modern capitalism as the turning point. So these are the feminist theories that I deal as the framework of it. And in Angela Davis's Woman, Race, and Class from 1981, she has this chapter called The Approaching Obsolescence of Housework, a Working Class Perspective. And she believes that women's work, really housework, it has been taken by industrialization of its products through capitalism. And that left women's work as undervalued and unpaid. So chores like cleaning, making the bed, child rearing, raising your kids, all of that goes unnoticed. And she believes that socialism is the solution to women's work being respected and will actually stop the labor exploitation of workers. Another theory from Serene Carter in Faux Feminism, Why We Fall for White Feminism and How We Can Stop, she believes that the idea that feminism as a fight for individual freedom is false because elite women who are free, meaning that they can have a job outside of the household, can profit off of the labor of women of color and the working class inside the household. She recommends that we must question men of their role and think about other important values in life in our society other than freedom, such as community and respect for one another. So my argument is that the gender gap is hidden from capitalism in our modern world. This contrasts with the ancient times and Regency era because there was an acknowledgement of women's subordination without the promise of climbing the social ladder. So the gender gap remains until this day. We don't blame men or capitalism from our public discourse. The ancient world has women as undervalued, invisible figures in the household. The Regency era has aristocratic women with certain freedoms under constraints, such as their husband or male figure. Whereas the modern world, they allow elite women to exploit the working class, especially Black women. So for each time, I represent one text for each phase. And in Medea, she's a foreign sorceress who marries Jason, a royal prince, and she is betrayed by her husband as he marries a younger princess. The tragic play follows Medea's schemes as she kills Jason, the younger princess, and her children as revenge. As historical context, household labor is a monotonous job. It's why servants, enslaved people, and children contribute to these jobs, since they are not citizens of the polis. And only high-class men who are citizens and can be at the symposium can educate themselves. And because of that role, they are able to intellectualize themselves outside the home. And this is where I believe the gender gap emerges. So in analysis, Medea proves that women are powerful people who contribute to our institutions and future workers. She even goes on to say how monotonous this job even is in monologues. And the gender gap's sinister aspect is the fact that women do more actions to compensate their oppressed position, whereas men, they're rewarded for it without any recognition. So an example is when Medea actually steals the golden fleece, whereas Jason just takes all of that credit. Then we move into the Regency era with Emma by Jane Austen. So Emma Woodhouse, she's a 21-year-old aristocratic woman who believes that she will not marry for its oppressive arrangement and restriction upon herself. She pursues matchmaking, which leaves her entangled in other people's business. And she even becomes friends with an orphan, Harriet Smith of lower middle class, as an aristocratic woman. And Emma ends up marrying a longtime friend, Mr. Knightley, who has educated her since birth. In the Regency era, women can train their intellect for activities like writing or being a governess. There's a societal appreciation for women to do work beyond the household, but it's only given to aristocratic women. Emma's ending in a marriage of equal match with Mr. Knightley demonstrates that only same-class marriages are appropriate, even same-class friendships like Harriet Smith. Emma also steps down from her public image as a matchmaker to an aristocratic wife in the household with her husband and father. This is striking because the ancients had a mentorship between an older man and a younger boy, but it was educational, as the latter grows up to become a citizen of the palace. For Emma, she enters this mentorship with Mr. Knightley, but does not receive the same opportunities as a citizen. In our modern world, we have The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. So in the 1940s in Lorain, Ohio, Pecola Breedlove, an 11-year-old black girl, wishes for the bluest eyes. She goes through a series of traumatic events that make her subconsciously realize the beauty of whiteness that leaves her insane. So in the historical context, women are further divided on racial and class lines. That is more seen. Women of color in domestic jobs allow their employers to work in the public sphere. Women working outside the household made people assume that women were empowered, which was in many ways not the case. In analysis, Mrs. Breedlove, Pecola's mother, has a domestic job in the White Fisher household. It acts as a dream for Mrs. Breedlove, as she can manage that household. She's unable to make a perfect household in her own family, whereas when she's in the Fisher household, she can pretend that the appliances and the children are her own. She takes greater care as a domestic worker than she does as a mother to her own children. So race and class become prominent in this story that has the elite white people maintaining their positions because women of color and the poor are doing the household work. The bigger system looming over is capitalism, as the market does not value housework. So in conclusion, there needs to be solidarity in social movements that can stand for the equality of all sexes. The gender gap is exactly what it is, a gap. To bridge that distance means people need to agree in being against oppression. We have not done this yet, and it requires a collective action that serves all women. Some recommendations: discuss with others about the gender gap, especially men, and what it means to you. Take courses, read literature, attend lectures that relates to domestic work, feminist, and political studies. Contribute in protests or social groups that provide a direct call to action. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Arnold, for this thesis and really consolidating this semester. Thank you, Professor Robin, for literally all the texts and from last semester for this thesis. Thank you, Professor Cotter, for literally providing the framework for this, and Professor Yarrow this semester for giving the context of ancient Greek and Rome during that time. So thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is May Hoffman, and I'm going to be presenting on the topic of the problem of Hasidic education. So for those of you who do not know much about the Hasidic community, it's essentially an ultra-Orthodox, ultra-religious Jewish community that does its best to remain isolated from the rest of the world. They restrict access to the internet, and the group primarily communicates in their own language, in Yiddish. So my paper will focus specifically on the Hasidic educational systems and the inadequacies inherent to its educational systems. So first, just some basic characteristics about the Hasidic educational system. Hasidic schools are strictly gender segregated, with the boys' schools facing significantly greater educational deficiencies than the girls. So this presentation will focus solely on the education within the boys' system because it's just so much more pronounced, the deficiencies. So the basic educational framework is that boys within the community spend most of their school days focused on religious studies and receive only 90 minutes of secular instruction per day. And this instruction is limited solely to the subjects of English and mathematics. So what that means is that these students never receive any education in history, in science, in art, in music, in gym. It's only English and math. And this minimal education is also it ends entirely when these students are 12 years old. Compounding upon this problem is the fact that secular subjects are often taught by unqualified teachers, many of whom lack fluency in English and teach English and math in the Yiddish language and were themselves educated in these same substandard schools. Ultimately, as a result of these systemic issues, many Hasidic boys leave school with limited English proficiency and poor mathematical skills. My research question essentially focuses on how and why these Hasidic educational institutions have been allowed to continue operating in clear violation of New York state law, which stipulates that private schools must offer an education that is substantially equivalent to that provided by public schools. This clearly is not happening within the Hasidic community, and so my research essentially outlines and investigates a bunch of factors that contribute to the persistence of this educational framework. My argument, which was formulated after doing a lot of research and also personal interviews with former students that attended these schools and also current students who are actively attending these schools, is that Hasidic educational institutions have been allowed to continue operating due to a confluence of interrelated cultural, historical, religious, political, and institutional factors. These include the community's post-Holocaust insularity, ideological resistance to secular knowledge, lack of awareness on the issue, suppression of reform efforts, and most critically, the political power of the Hasidic voting bloc, which incentivizes elected officials to protect the status quo in exchange for electoral support. So, just for some background on the issue that also contributes to the problem of Hasidic education is that the Hasidic community was founded by Holocaust survivors, and which developed this insular society in order to preserve and protect its religious traditions and its faith, which they felt were extremely threatened. This intergenerational trauma of the Holocaust continues to shape the ethos and the structure of the community, especially in its approach to education. At the core of the Hasidic community is an ingrained mistrust and fear of outsiders, as well as secular ideas and values. From the survivors' lived experiences, secular values contribute to both complicity in and apathy to genocide, and therefore present an existential threat to their way of life. Ironically, this mentality has led to a system where these Hasidic boys do not even receive any education in history, and therefore do not receive an education on the Holocaust, despite the fact that it continues shaping their daily lives. Ultimately, the present state of Hasidic education reflects both the protective strategies of a traumatized generation and the long-term implications of their ideological legacy, which facilitate the preservation of their tradition, culture, and religion at any cost. So another factor that contributes to the persistence of the Hasidic educational system is just the community structure. The Hasidic educational framework served as a mechanism to keep community members confined within its boundaries by leaving students utterly unprepared to succeed in the most fundamental ways if they choose to leave the community. Ultimately, in a community governed by fear and where education is perceived as the gateway out, the current educational system persists not by neglect, but by design. Another important factor that contributes to this issue is just the lack of awareness surrounding this topic. Most people, due to the extreme insularity of the Hasidic community, outsiders of the community just don't even understand that this issue exists, and therefore it can just continue persisting because it just goes largely unnoticed. Into this vacuum, there's this advocacy organization called YAFED, which stands for Young Advocates for Fair Education. The goal of this advocacy organization is just to spread awareness about this topic and to expose how the Hasidic community is violating the New York substantial equivalency law and to just demand accountability. In response to the backlash that the Hasidic community has received from YAFED and from the awareness that YAFED brought, the Hasidic community will frame any attack on its educational institution as anti-Semitic. They will use religion and religious freedom and anti-Semitism as a shield to ward off any criticisms of their educational institutions. But ultimately, religion and education can coexist, and a basic education does not undermine anyone's religious freedom. Lastly, the most important factor that contributes to the persistence of the Hasidic educational system is the power of the Hasidic voting bloc. The Hasidic electorate comprises an estimated 200,000 voters who largely cast identical ballots based on the endorsement of a selected candidate by prominent community leaders and rabbis. In exchange for this bloc support, political candidates often ignore the ongoing educational neglect occurring within these Hasidic educational institutions. This dynamic was particularly evident in the 2021 New York City mayoral race, where candidates like Andrew Yang and Eric Adams praised the state of Hasidic education. Eric Adams actually went down to one of these Hasidic schools, and he said, direct quote, that the education in these schools was better than that received in public schools, which is just false. There's also been evidence of political deals that have been done between the Hasidic community and the mayor's office. So in 2015, YAFED, the advocacy organization, submitted a complaint against New York State. And this complaint triggered an investigation into 39 Hasidic schools. However, although the investigation started in 2015, the results of the investigation was not released until 2019. The reason for this is that it was revealed that Mayor de Blasio was intentionally stalling the release of this report in order to avoid alienating Hasidic leaders. This example just kind of goes to show that the Hasidic community realizes the political capital that they hold, and they wield this capital in a way to protect themselves from accountability for their educational institutions. In conclusion, the Hasidic educational system represents a systemic failure that denies thousands of children their legal right to basic education. Rooted in historical trauma and sustained by political complicity, this crisis extends beyond cultural difference and exposes a breakdown in oversight and accountability. As the community grows, so does the urgency for meaningful reform to ensure educational justice for all students. This topic is really important to me. I know it's kind of like a niche topic, but I personally grew up within the Hasidic community, and this is my little brother. I have 3 younger brothers who are currently attending these schools and who are actively being harmed by this issue. And so I'm super grateful to Professor Arnold that I've been able to write my thesis presentation and my thesis paper on this topic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aisha, and my presentation is on We the People, Democratic Backsliding in the U.S. and France through Comparative Historical Injustice. So my research question is, why do certain Western countries experience or bounce back from democratic backsliding easier than others? So for my main argument, I say that despite the US and France's notion of democracy and democratic ideals originating from the same movement, the Enlightenment, both nations have different historical circumstances that influence their foundational understanding of democracy and how rights are distributed. This foundational understanding of democracy influences how citizens over time are conditioned to defend it. So for the US, slavery and attempts to justify the denial of rights toward African Americans have created systemic racism that has persisted since the nation's founding. For France, the emergence of nativism and Islamophobia has been exacerbated by the rise in right-wing political parties. So in my paper, I argue that the U.S.'s foundational notion of democracy has been challenged by the issue of race and slavery since its foundation, making its ability to fight against democratic backsliding severely undermined. Because France's experience with significant democratic backsliding is recent, France is likely to bounce back from democratic backsliding more easily. So a main contributor to my paper is Gordon, who provides great constitutional implications through an examination and analysis of France and the U.S.'s constitutions. So for France, the wording of the French Constitution establishes a sense of unity by utilizing the term indivisible. It delineates the structure of government, but it also serves as a tool for cultural unification. So the French people is a fusion of ethnicity and democracy, so there's an established national identity, being French. For the U.S., however, the people in the Constitution are more of a loose amalgam of individuals, more than like a true American people. There are repeated themes of a federation, powers belonging to states, freed people, men, and this implies that there is no primordial inherent unity of the American people. And a quote from Gordon's contribution is that Americans refer to themselves as, or others as Italian Americans or Jewish Americans, for example. The reason is now clear. It is because being French represents the ethnic and the political sides of identity simultaneously. So for the founder's dilemma, I chose to utilize Jefferson as one of the founding fathers who accurately and explicitly discusses how the issue of race it can be hypocritical when discussing the extension of democratic ideals towards U.S. citizens. I specifically chose the notes on the state of Virginia and his letter to John Holmes, which was interesting because they were written nearly 40 years apart. So for the notes on the state of Virginia, he talks about Black people in the U.S. and the issue of whether to emancipate them or not. And not only does he suggest that race mixing will exterminate both the both the white and Black race, but that these differences are in no way justified because of intrinsic differences in race. So not only between differences in race between like blood, he also makes a distinguish between the two on the basis of mental faculties. And in his letter to Jefferson to John Holmes, one of the most important lines is that justice is in one scale and preservation is in the other. This is nearly 40 years later and is in response to the issue of emancipation. And I think this line was very interesting because you are introduced with a dilemma of what is justice and what is preservation? Preservation of the state of the Union by maintaining slavery, but also justice that we've deemed as an extension of democratic ideals and rights towards all people. So for France, I decided to trace Islamophobia through the rise of the National Rally Party, which is France's far-right party, and a way that I was clearly able to kind of follow along historical injustices has been the mistreatment and discrimination towards Muslims in France. I kind of give a brief overview of the rise of the National Rally, the far-right party in France, and near its foundation, it appealed to the veterans of the Algerian Revolution, Algeria, a predominantly Muslim country, and then how the revolution kind of created a big rift between Algeria and France. So in 2024, the President Emmanuel Macron called a snap election to clarify the political landscape, but ended up initiating an election in which no French party won the majority, which kind of created a hung parliament for France. While a leftist coalition did end up winning a small majority of the parliament seats, the rise in far-right ideology has produced a panic for all citizens. And one of the biggest ways that we've seen this is regarding the National Rally and the motivation of nativism in France. It has kind of led to the passing of arguably Islamophobic laws such as banning hijabs in sports and the public, and ultimately attacks on Muslim citizens and people of color in France altogether. So media depictions of French citizens in the wake of the second round of elections reveal immense relief, but arguably, because it was such a close call in the election, and it wasn't until the second round that we see a small leftist coalition being able to bounce back from a hung parliament, we see that the amount of progress that the French have made has not been necessarily enough for it to be undeniable. So, in conclusion, Gordon, from earlier in the paper, distinguishes the U.S. from France by valuing the constitutions. U.S. identity is fundamentally segmented compared to France, and the notions of individuality in the U.S. emphasize an already divided nation that wasn't necessarily indicated in the French Constitution. For the Founding Fathers, slavery is an explicit underminer of democracy, and the founders are aware of this, but choose to justify it. This reinforces the U.S.'s segmented national identity, embeds racial discrimination in the U.S., and obscures the true meaning of democracy, which makes it harder for the U.S. to conceptualize and further defend. So in our case studies of the U.S. and France and their relative historical injustices, we are shown, unlike the U.S., French concept of democracy and whose rights are extended to was not deliberately undermined by its founders. Both the U.S. and France have had crucial elections in the past 2 years, but France has, in some slight way, still remained a slightly left majority in government. While Macron is liberal, arguably, I guess he doesn't kind of identify with that fully, but from the current administration, we can see that there's a spectrum of how far right he can go, and clearly France has not really reached that level yet, especially with Parliament still holding a slightly left majority, while both houses of the U.S. Congress are right-wing. And then regarding slavery and racism in the U.S., while both nations have experienced democratic backsliding, France's ability to organize massive civilian protests, quickly build left coalitions in threatening times, and produce the results of the last election reveal a vitality in the nation's voter base that originates from its constitution's fusion of ethnicity and democracy. Any threat to French democracy is a threat to this French identity. And this unique sense of democracy makes the democratic experience more personal for its citizens, rather than it being an abstract concept that has been shaky since its adoption. And lastly, I end with a quote by Gordon. Only national sentiment is powerful enough to make a community feel moral outrage over the persistent inequality of some of its members. For the federal government to undertake a national program of acculturation would require a degree of consensus on the components of American ethno-nationality the United States has never had. Thank you.
All right. Can you all hear me? All right. I tend to be too loud. So yeah, years of rock music. Wow, that was you all were phenomenal, by the way. It was yeah, put me to shame for sure. But yeah, Professor Arnold, I just want to really thank you for giving me the room to sort of really go out and find something and really learn to exercise the going from the induction, the inductive reasoning, and building from the ground up, and like that back to the deductive reasoning and back and forth, and like really exercising that part of my brain. And it's very, very difficult to do, but you know, I'm having a great time doing it. And just full disclosure, this is like a work in progress. So I am kind of welcome the feedback and kind of dissect my brain. But so my question is why has America never had an enduring progressive movement? And for me, this was really rooted in, so full disclosure, I'm a philosophy major and a big Hegelian. Thank you to Professor Angelica Nuzzo, who finally got me to understand sort of his brilliant notions of contradiction, is that there's this philosophical adage that the theory of non-contradiction, that one thing cannot both be and not be in the same place at the same time in the same manner. And that's sort of been, right, you can't be alive and dead at the same time. And for the most part, that's kind of been axiomatic. But a lot of philosophers have kind of poked against that. And Hegel was the person who said, no, we are contradiction. And the way we get better and grow is through overcoming contradictions. And alienate your mind goes out and alienates itself, like to comprehend subjects or aspects, and then it sort of recognizes itself when it comes to, and it sees, hey, you're me, like oh wow, and it like comprehends it and goes back. So along comes Karl Marx, and he says, yes, you're right, like for sure, all the way. That is like how movement works. That's how progress works. but you're wrong because it's not idealism. So you don't overcome these contradictions only in your mind, because there's this thing called capitalism that started with the very real material contradiction of the estranged labor of humanity. So that is basically an ontological reality, is that there is nothing natural or real about capitalism. And so that's really have a Hegelian world where we are free to be ourselves and freely choose our labor, and like with our mind that is free. We have to overcome the material conditions first. So what I wanted to do was, apathy for me has been something I'm kind of working on, this theory, in like maybe a book someday, or just kind of, I like to see that. I feel like theories can change minds and move worlds for the better and for the worse, unfortunately. And so apathy is inertia, and that's not movement. So if you're apathetic, you're not moving through anything. So for me, apathy, if you have apathy, basically capital wins, because apathy, inertia, that's a lie, right? The normal ontology is movement through contradiction. So if people think they're powerless, then like there's no hope. So what I want to do with several theories, and I'll tell you just ahead, my methodology was to sort of combine all these wonderful theories that you lent us, really phenomenal, and kind of pick and choose, and rather than kind of being negative, even though it's a negative question, why has America never had an enduring progressive movement, to kind of pick the best parts and put something together where, truth be told, I guess maybe I'm being a little greedy, because there is the behavioral versus structure argument, and I really want to believe, and I truly do, that you can have individual agency, and that it's not just inevitable, but that like you can't just say, oh, I'm a revolutionary in my mind, and therefore we're all free. So there is this, I think both are true. And so what I wanted to do was take Ilan Kapoor's dependency theory and post-colonial theory, and which are sort of the behavior versus structural arguments, and kind of like pick and choose. And ultimately, there's a quote that I really like. But yeah, so and here's an example. So Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, her post-colonial framework, I find it to be a very useful iteration for analyzing the failure of progressive movements, because Spivak believes that the goal of the post-colonial theorist is to record the silence of the marginalized, so as to valorize the difference, and to criticize the domination of oppressive discourses. Just because a progressive movement seemingly failed by structural standards of political economy does in no way imply that those who partook in the struggle did not leave a worthy dent in this world, a dent worthy of being preserved and studied for a guide in the perpetual struggle over the ever-shifting landscape where humans of all constitutions strive to be recognized as such. The battle over ideological hegemony is never static either. And so what I like about Spivak, for instance, is that she acknowledges the material conditions of capitalism. And what I'm having trouble with is I have a huge glut of case studies. So if I had all the time in the world, I probably wouldn't, even if I lived to like 90 years old writing this, I probably wouldn't be able to answer this. But I wanted to maybe even start from the failed campaigns of Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 campaign and go all the way back, like reverse chronology, back to Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, and his analysis of the backlash or the counter-revolution of labor, and also this phenomenal chapter called The Transubstantiation of the Poor White, which is all about Andrew Johnson, and how, for me, he kind of embodies this kind of, and I think this what you were picking up on, Aisha, like sort of the differences in how we other one another, and in our Constitution, kind of like the segregation and like the slavery, like in the Constitution itself, and that in Andrew Johnson there is this poor Southern man who hated the aristocracy. He wanted to do away with estranged labor and like just big monopoly capitals that were oppressing his people. But as soon as he got to the presidency, by dint of a bullet, an assassination, he basically chose white supremacy over really having a chance to undo the aristocracy. So my big problem is I want to use these like big grand case studies like the Civil War, like W.E.B. Du Bois, but I also want to mix it with sort of like my three home bases for case studies, by the way, are W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, 1860 to 1880, Eugene V. Debs, Citizen and Socialist, and Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed and How They Feel by Francis Fox Piven. In particular, the case study on welfare movements, which is this really phenomenal case study where people were basically advocating and really had solidarity with each other, and people were going to welfare offices to benefits that they were entitled to, and there was this solidarity where they really, like, when people were next to each other that didn't have any skin in the game, they felt that real solidarity. So I guess ultimately what I'm having a problem doing is that I think we're in a neoliberal era. And for instance, Gosta Esping Anderson, one of her frameworks is that we're sort of, the regulation theory of, I believe, Clarence Stone, if I'm not mistaken, but that there is this kind of, and all across literature, there's or neoliberal literature or economic analysis, there's this kind of belief like we're in the post-Fordist economy. So how do I focus only on this region that we're living in to see why we haven't had a progressive movement, or do I go back to show that like throughout American history, Eugene V. Debs was like the 6'2" guy that would like move people to tears. He was jailed for his labor activism, jailed in the Pullman strikes of 1890s, and jailed for speaking out against World War I in the 19-teens. And still, people would be moved to tears knowing that they were harmed by capitalism and vote the Democratic Party or vote Republican. And so that's what I want to know is how can and I'll end with this, is that every time, and this is what I'm all for unions and industrial unionism, and part of the reason Eugene V. Debs, some people think that he might have made an error when he parted with Big Bill Haywood. He was sort of a more militant labor activist, but ultimately, how can every time there was like a big union gain for labor movements, it wasn't unions. It was people. It was from people sacrificing themselves, or for what Spivak would say is the voiceless, the marginalized. They were always there first. So I really believe in that the voiceless have always been there for gains. And so I just hope to find through archaeology of failures how we can give these voiceless people an enduring voice that isn't just always thwarted by repressive regimes. Thank you. All right.
Thank you all. That was amazing. And I just have to say a shout out to Professor Arnold, because that's a lot of stewarding you did. And I have two questions, one for Cindy. I think this is a fair question since we had feminist theory together. I'm curious about why you chose gender gap as the concept you're using, and sort of, I'm not actually sure what you mean. And then for Aisha, my question is, I'm more critical of France than you are, and I wondered, you kind of took racism out of the frame when you look at France, and maybe it's different because France's racism was in its colonialism instead of internal. So I kind of wondered if you had given any thought about what to do with colonialism when thinking about French democracy, or that's kind of a left field question, so you can always say no. But thank you very much, all of you.
Okay, I can go first. Thank you for your question, Professor Johnson. I really appreciate it. And this actually ties back to Professor Robbins' course last semester, where I tackled the question of why do age gap relationships exist? And basically the answer was tied to the gender gap. I believe that because of patriarchy, we see tangible consequences of literally men surpassing women. And throughout the presentation, when I put up examples of when you go outside the home and have a job, that leaves still women having a dual role, both outside and inside. And it's the working class and people of color who are the most exploited in this case. So I believe that this really is rooted with the inequality of the sexes. It's never a correct thing. We never approach a perfect society with this. So I really believe that this gap nowadays, we acknowledge it, but not to the extent that it has been in the past.
Regarding France, the reason why I kind of not necessarily outsourced or tried to divert away from like not classical racism, but like racism towards through colonialism is because I originally was viewing my research question through the lens like post-colonial theory, and I felt like it would be an interesting way to think of the France and U.S. as issues that happened domestically through a post-colonial theoretical approach towards those who may be in those countries who were probably affected by it in the past. And so because slavery was, even though it included like the direct outsourcing, like imperialism of extracting Africans into the U.S., it kind of was built into the foundation of the U.S. and it still lingers on, like it's become systemic. Regarding Islamophobia, the reason why I had chosen it is because with the French issue of indivisibility, you kind of had that kind of gelling over the French people, which Gordon identifies as an issue. And I feel like one of the most prominent ways that we have seen those ethnic and regional divides emerge has been through the explicit legislation passing towards Muslims and Islamophobia rising in France especially. And so I feel like by looking at Islamophobia and then kind of seeing where it kind of starts with colonial actions in Northern Africa and Islamic countries, and seeing how the National Party in France is kind of built upon that nativism and Islamophobic ideology, I think that was the kind of way where I could keep the post-colonial theoretical approach of seeing formerly colonized peoples, at the same time have them still be domestically affected by them, if that makes sense.
Oh my God. I shout up like, hi, I'm meeting you today, Melissa. But oh my God, my former classmates. I'm really proud of you guys. Work? Okay. Anyway, yeah, I love all of your presentations and Adasia's as well. Like regarding sets, I think that it's very important to just like be as specific as possible, because it like that's just easier for the brain. If you just not like it's true. And also I think it's like very important to explicitly say why like far right wing movements are consistently, como se dice, like successful, and just tie it back to like how they all have like capital as the main thing that joins them, and not just talk about explicitly like why these separate progressive movements don't work. Like I want you to really compare and contrast them. And maybe I remember you were like very passionate about this past election, so maybe you could just use that one specifically as your case study, because that also relates to like so many different things. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. And again, I'm proud of you.
Yeah, no, Melissa, that's a really good point. I mean, I think part of like the downer part, and I think like back to like the contradiction is like I go back and forth between like, is there hope, is there not? But the downer part is like, I want to focus a lot on that part of the reason progressive movements fail isn't because they weren't strong, is because of like how repressive they were. and how, I mean, people, the Black Panther Party, members of that were jailed. I mean, and psychologically tormented and put in solitary confinement because they were seen as a very real threat, not because of like crime, but because of ideologically what they were trying to do. And a lot of the Black Panther members saw the real, viscerally felt as 20-year-olds, and young men. I still don't know if I'm that mature to viscerally feel that solidarity the way they did with people in Vietnam and people in Africa going through decolonization struggles. But yeah, the violence is not to be underestimated at all. The Ku Klux Klan was, I mean, in 1860 through 1880, things were, for a time, things were looking very promising. And the Ku Klux Klan and Andrew Johnson and the North basically pulling out to get on with business as usual just led to Jim Crow and basically 80 years until the Voting Rights Act. So yeah, I want to focus on that for sure. And you're right to focus on the election and the Bernie. I think there's a very interesting correlation between the Bernie to Trump pipeline that I'm fascinated by.
I want to make certain that people don't have to stay here putting people from and past when we're working, but maybe we want to do the last question, and then I think, is it okay if we stay in the room and talk, or? Okay. Yes. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so my question is for May. Is this thing on, or can you all hear me? Fine. Yeah, so my question is, how come the boys and girls receive a different education in the Hasidic schools? I know part of the answer is that they want the boys to take up the religious duty later and to know the Torah, but is there another reason why girls get, or do they get more secular education as well?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I didn't really focus on the girls' education is because it's so much more complicated. The Hasidic community is not a monolith. There are so many different groups and sects, and then there's sects within sects, and then there are so many cultural differences between these sects. So for the boys' system, it doesn't really matter the sect that you are part of or the group that you are part of. The education is the same regardless of the sect. The problem with the girls' school is that there's a continuum, and if you go to a more religious sect and you're part of a more religious sect and you go to a more religious school, the education you receive is way worse than if you are part of a different sect that is more moderate. So it's a lot more complicated, the girls' education, but girls do receive a better education, on the whole. Girls do receive science, math, history, English. Those 4 basic subjects are taught at every Hasidic girls' school. However, the more extreme schools will focus on home economics, and it will be way more religious in that way. One of the reasons that the girls do receive better education is because in the Torah, in the Bible, it states that what's the right word for this? The honor of what's called again learning the Torah is only something that is needed for the men. The girls do not have to learn the Torah. The girls do not have to pray. It's something that only the men have to do, and the girls are just kind of supposed to support the men in their prayers and in their learning. And so therefore the girls are able to receive a better education. I don't know if that makes sense.